Hello. Thank you, Lola, for that amazing introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight and for having us. We are agency, as Lola mentioned, and today we'll talk. We've broken the lecture up into two parts. You'll see the first half we'll talk about our research, and the second half we will talk about our projects. And in our practice, we work to identify and transform emerging urban paradigms in order to enable the production of new forms of public space. As both researchers and designers, we embrace confrontational roles in order to create objects, forms, spaces, databases, and argument that instrumentalize spatial justice. Our interdisciplinary practice engages these shifts in contemporary cultures through architecture, urbanism, and advocacy. And our projects range from media environments to guerrilla infrastructural installations to architectural projects to speculative urban research and, in general, public awareness campaigns. And so while territories shape forms, we like to argue that forms can reciprocate and shape territories. We live and practice in a context steps from the US-Mexico border where public space and public life is continuously threatened. Vast geographies are defined by an all-encompassing and pervasive security apparatus. We're here monitored and surveilled, where the public realm of the contemporary city has become a victim of these spatial instruments of suppression. And so we read our particular environment as a kind of bellwether for transformations throughout American cities, where this context is a testing ground for novel security technologies which are soon to transform the domestic interior. And what you're seeing here is the US-Mexico border fence that already exists. And despite these threats, we like to craft opportunities for new publics to emerge in order to reclaim a space for public discourse and debate. We craft objections, targeting the under-considered aspects of the built environment that put human lives and human rights at risk. We like to transform objects, orchestrating unexpected spatial effects that can leverage the economies of ready-mades, byproducts, and efficient custom assemblies. And we articulate objectives, advocating and providing the space for the new public encounters. And so the research and the three projects that we'll share with you today, this is our way of working through these projects to image and to coerce insecurities that threaten our public lives and our public space. The research and the project you'll see engage these insecurities at different scales, subverting them in order to empower publics with agency.
So we have a perspective that's not unique to our context, but perhaps common throughout the U.S. and increasingly throughout the world, that public space is threatened. The amount of space dedicated to the public or available to new forms of publics is not only dwindling, but where it still exists, it is under attack. It's targeted, surveilled, etc. So while public space is targeted, it paradoxically can form new publics which are increasingly insecure, and that's really the theme of what we want to talk about tonight. We're interested in the ways in which different technologies and different forms of spatial control manifest themselves in the domestic realm, but also abroad as the nation state and its sort of apparatus kind of expands, where we see that vast geographies are defined by an all-encompassing and pervasive security apparatus. And we say that our world is increasingly shaped by what might be known as securocratic regimes. So this idea of the securocratic, you can think of the word bureaucrat or technocrat as a kind of similar word, but the securocrat refers to a regime which is poorly defined, very expansive, and defined by security concerns. So things like the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, these sort of ambitions that subsume large and poorly defined territories in the name of control shape space in their image. Michel Foucault and later Stephen Graham, the urban geographer, would identify what are known as boomerang effects, where the technologies that are developed abroad in order to enact a securocratic regime echo back home and start to define the types of technologies we see over our heads and in our space. The contemporary city then is monitored, surveilled, and patrolled by all sorts of technologies that inhabit this intersection. A technology that was actually born and bred very close to our home in Ciudad Juarez ended up being the kind of impetus for this non-ironically named company called Persistent Surveillance, which basically enlists private pilots flying overhead major metropolitan areas to submit their videos and their photographs of everyday activity in order to aid in law enforcement. And this is just increasingly common, this kind of blurring of the lines between a public activity, an activity made public, and an activity that is in fact spying on the public. As Lola mentioned, we're developing a book called Fronts, Security in the Developing World, where we look at the kind of geography, the hidden geography, where these issues of security and surveillance intersect our homeland in the U.S. In our research, we are looking at sites like this. This is in New Mexico, a town called Playas, which has been appropriated by the Department of Homeland Security and other law enforcement agencies in order to train for urban warfare. And the book really looks at the intersections of these training environments, which emulate a kind of perceived threat, and the real-world environments that they increasingly incriminate. In our research, we've identified this pervasive idea that the shape of the built environment, the metrics of the built environment, actually, to a large extent, shape the security apparatus's response. So this concept that we call morphometrics, where the morphology of an urban form or an architectural form is not seen as necessarily neutral, but might be an index or a precursor for future intervention. So the shapes and the textures and the patterns of urban life and architectural form become this kind of canvas to play out these fantasies of kind of operations and destruction. And they're scanned and routinely evaluated for threats to a perceived public. Formal building codes and even architectural codes are then mirrored in the kind of language of security in documents like this one, which trains a very particular reading of urban space relative to the types of machineries and machinations that move through the space. And a different kind of urban topography, but also topology exists within this reading of the city, where different types of surfaces within the city, what are called intra-surfaces and hyper-surfaces, different way of classifying the types of interiors and exteriors, above ground and below ground scenarios, is well documented and well understood by military personnel and by police forces that are trained to move swiftly and smoothly through this environment. A lot of the images you're seeing are actually taken from military training manuals and other law enforcement training manuals. So in this system, any abnormality might be seen as a condition of criminality and might therefore be criminalized, creating a kind of morphometric targeting system. So the military has decisively kind of co-opted the city and urban forms as a space for training and has routinely used these sites in order to prepare for different actions in public space. We visit these sites. These are actually photos from a military installation close to where we live and work, Fort Bliss, one of the largest and oldest military bases in the U.S., where different structures are built in order to emulate different areas of the developing world. This, like many sites like it, are cities that are built from scratch in order to kind of approximate the urban forms that we might imagine our military would be intervening in theaters abroad.
And so we counter map these environments, and we're, as we mentioned, or as you can see in the title of the lecture, with public insecurities, we're always interested in sort of uncovering these insecurities. So we've been counter mapping the dedicated sites of this urban simulation and morphometrics. And we've been able to uncover through scraping government databases and congressional budget hearings about 500 or more of these sites, that these are cities either built from scratch or repurposed for urban warfare training and simulation. And there are three types of these that we're generally working with. There are leftover or forgotten or abandoned American cities that already exist. This is a former copper mining town, and you can see here the insertion of a North African village for warfare training, depending on sort of the theater of war. And then there are towns that are built, purpose-built from scratch in the desert, and kind of simulating urban forms as if they've been there for decades. And also to accelerate training, these are also towns that are purpose-built to a gold standard that take the greatest hits of urban form, as it were, in order to be tested upon for a very specific kind of urban warfare. And so while discrete urban forms and urban types, while these forms are really discrete, the maps of the sites start to tell us more about the reorganization of the world, and they map a different territory that's clearly transnational, transpolitical, and operates at a global scale, which then brings into question issues of borders and boundaries, but also control. And so several of these maps that will also be as part of the book will be broadcast online. So this will be the first of its kind, fully available geospatial database of these sites. So the global migration and detention sites are directly related to war and conflict. Extraction landscapes and waste sites also kind of coincide with the developing world and places of low resource. And also the conflict and humanitarian aid kind of industrial complex that sort of piggybacks onto the military industrial complex, as we're seeing in the book. And so these databases are starting to tell us a story about the world, essentially.
So part of the work that's enabled by us having this really robust geolocated database of all of these sites from scraping Google Earth and other sources, we're able to see the kind of common forms and tropes that are replicated on these sites, and we're able, as kind of spatial analysts, to decipher the kind of most common and least common forms that are replicated. And so here in a kind of typological study where we see this kind of excerpted urbanism that gets repeated almost endlessly across these sites, we see a real intensity of certain typologies repeated over and over again, especially tropes of domestic space, commercial space, public programs, but importantly, towards the bottom and increasingly, environments that replicate common forms in informal environments and in the developing world, part of the world that's sort of expanding at the most rapid rate. The book is structured in basically three different themes: the proto-city, the logistic city, and the carceral city. And those are sort of explored through kind of these dualities of different typologies that are indicative of different spatial conceptions that we read through the kind of militarized environments. These are some photos from visits again to Fort Bliss, but you can see the kind of materiality or the lack of materiality from this kind of excerpted urbanism. We mentioned these are the so-called greatest hits, right, of the modern city, or perhaps the lowest common denominator. Spaces which afford a certain type of familiarity for different training operations in order for infantry and other actors to plan to overtake, but also forms that sort of connote different cultural logics and perhaps distinctions that might prove problematic upon deployment or intervention by the world's military. So the cemetery, for instance, is a site that's used in training with all of its sort of cultural baggage, training soldiers actually to not respect, in many cases, the kind of taboo of military action within the cemetery, as they're subjected to different training scenarios where the imagined enemy doesn't respect the space the way that a typical soldier might by default. So these are some excerpts from the database where we're able to then go to each site and understand from a radically kind of public perspective what these highly secretive sites and secretive forums begin to look like, the kinds of patterns that emerge. So examples of the zone logic as deployed on the site were different sort of fortified embankments and staging areas replicate around their edges, to the proliferation of the embassy as a kind of discrete zone, a kind of supranational or extranational kind of bubble within the imagined city, to places like dumps and junkyards, police stations and jails, mosques, which are perhaps one of the most common typologies that are replicated, to informal environments like trailer parks, so-called shanty towns, and other informal arrangements of different domestic structures scattered over the sites. So our analysis is able to sort of track, using this kind of radar graph, the tendency of these simulated cities. Each one of these circles represents one sort of mega site that we've identified. And the graph represents the tendency of these simulated cities towards different types of program, so industrial, commercial, residential, informal, giving us a sense of the kind of signature of the simulated city and the signature of the targeted city by extension. This is a look at the aerial photos of some of the sites, demonstrating the wide range of scales, but the common deployment of informal typologies highlighted in red. And from this, we also study the ways in which the space is represented in order to be operated within. And we find drawings like these, a kind of militarized architectural plan showing the kind of deployment of different events and scenarios within a rather reductive representation of the space. And we extrapolate the logics in order to identify sites which are real-world sites, which represent the perhaps most intense realization of the targeted features that we've identified. And we work through the logics of the eventual occupation and cohabitation of the security complex with the living, mostly informal cities present on these sites through drawings like these. This next project, which is what we call the Feral Federation, looks again at developing a kind of public database in order to understand a a changing perception of cities and their I guess, representation as sites of potential criminality. And what we're interested in here is the designation that's become increasingly common in military parlance ever since sort of shortly after the U.S. entry into Iraq and Afghanistan, I guess 18 years ago now. And that is the designation of cities as so-called feral cities. So this word feral has historically been used to reference a kind of animal or perhaps a human which is inhabiting a kind of wild state. In military theory, that designation has been now applied to urban environments to designate a city that is beyond the control of law and that is perhaps operating through kind of extra-legal or paramilitary or perhaps terrorist or cartel networks as sort of prime actors in the organizational systems of the cities. And so we've seen this shift from feral figures to feral environments. And the feral city has many names. And we use in this project, which is basically to uncover the geography of so-called ferality in order to expose in some way the hypocrisy of this designation. We find that sort of analogs to this term are increasingly common in popular press, journalistic press, and also military documents. So places like cartel cities, no-go zones, anarchist cities, paramilitary cities, etc., are sort of proxies for this idea of the city beyond control. And through our research, some of the major writings actually of so-called feral cities designate surprisingly dissimilar cities in the same types of terms. So this is a glimpse at the Feral Federation database, but you can see that actually cities like New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina is designated at the highest level of ferality by this term, or St. Louis or Chicago during Black Lives Matter protests are designated as beyond control because of the types of activities that take place within them. And so in order to visualize and sort of enact a kind of public around this term, around cities that are designated with this term, which also interestingly incorporates several of the cities along the U.S.-Mexico border, including our neighbor to the south, which we spend a great deal of time in, Ciudad Juarez. The Feral Federation is really a project that operates with the logic of sort of nation building in order to establish this kind of extra-state, post-national network of cities as a constellation of sites under various forms of targeting based on this designation. Here you see some of the public events that were enacted in order to raise sort of dialogue in this regard, and a kind of ongoing development of the descriptions of the geography of ferality through this kind of atlas, through which each city can understand its designation and its relationship to similarly designated cities worldwide.
And so the Feral Federation is online right now. It's .org, and the hope is that these cities can actually sort of be part of the database and start to communicate through it as a way to constellate their own political and economic relationships, post-nationally or outside of their national borders. So that's just a really big project. But as Lola mentioned earlier, we are here at the U.S.-Mexico border. We moved there 3 years ago. We decided to sort of live the work and the practice and teach there. What you're seeing is El Paso in the foreground with all of the buildings, and then the lines of light up the mountain, that's Juarez. These cities are very close to each other. They're just separated by a fence. And it is the largest binational metroplex in the Western Hemisphere at about 3 million people. And the idea is to live and teach and to kind of deepen our research in this context. And part of it is broadcasting. So Stephen just talked about the research. This is the broadcast, is kind of the bridge between the research and the built work. We've been writing a series we call Border Dispatches for the Architects newspaper. Because this uncertainty and the fear about environments that are mostly kept secret has increased a lot in the U.S. and especially in the past 2 years with the current administration. And so this is kind of one way to render these insecurities transparent, or maybe not so insecure. And so we've looked at places like these, which are simulated border fences, where Border Patrol agents train to exclude others, and they train in these manners that you see below there, which, as far as we can tell, it's actually illegal to shoot from a fence across into another nation. To places like these, which are, this is Boquillas. It's incredibly remote in the Rio Grande Valley, which is a beautiful national monument. And this is a port of entry that is sensed, so it's working through facial recognition and through remote controlling. And so if you'd like to cross over, someone from El Paso will call at the port of entry, and you have this kind of virtual interview. And so the kind of the edges of control are increasing throughout our nation. And so the border crossing looks like this on a tiny boat. To also looking at these infrastructures, these other spaces of inclusion that the entire kind of surveillance and securocratic infrastructure enacts, the detention sites. Detention sites in the U.S. are increasingly run for profit. And these are migrant detention centers. They're not necessarily prisons, but they are run like so. So the Department of Homeland Security conducted research into its own practices in 2009, and even they had to admit that border detention were detaining migrants in a way in jails and prisons as if the immigration is criminal. And so there is an increasing network of these for-profit sites that shuttle humans around in order to keep them in the system longer, but also to increase the trail of paperwork. And there's a specific site near where we live, the Otero County facility, where it is highly specialized. So in order to make more profit, these sites specialize themselves in the services they provide. So this one only keeps people for one night, and they specialize in flying them out to Mexico. So about 160 people 3 times a week are flown to Mexico, regardless of where they came from. This is sort of a binational agreement. But the people who work there are actually people who came up through the penal system. So prison wards are kind of move through their career, and they end up being the wards of these spaces like these, where architecture and this kind of place becomes the extension of the arm of detention. And the people we interview who work there, they speak of migrants as bodies, so they have to count bodies, and so they talk of rooms and spaces in terms of how many bodies are kept, and they get 60 minutes a day of daylight, which is considered luxury, because apparently in prison you only get 30 minutes. And the last border dispatch was to uncover this illegal practice that the U.S. Border Patrol now is enacting, where you can see Border Patrol agents right here. This is the border, this little plaque, obviously U.S. and Mexico, and they are checking people's paperwork at the crossing before a port of entry, which forbids them from actually touching the port of entry to seek asylum. And so what this creates is that it sends people back, and then they end up having to cross the border not at border crossings, and so it becomes an illegal crossing. And so this practice is happening, and Amnesty Amnesty International has produced a huge report, but this was part of kind of our practice of crossing the border every day, trying to capture these moments and broadcast them. And moving into projects, this is where we teach. We teach for Texas Tech, which is an outpost in El Paso to serve the El Paso Juarez community with education. And so we are in a historic train station, which is still functioning. And so the first floor is used by the train station and people who take the train. And the second floor is where we have our studios and our work. And so in this context, we will talk a bit about three types of insecurities we're interested in. The first would be infrastructure at a much larger scale. When we first moved there, we were really sort of daunted by the way bodies and traffic and product is controlled. It's incredibly efficient moving through the border for those who have paperwork. But the most efficient kind of byproduct or object seem to be these orange street cones. These objects are moved daily in relationship to traffic patterns. And so we started to think that maybe sort of binational law seems to be inflected, or sort of like it becomes elastic in the hands of the daily workers who move these cones in sort of in flux. And so all of a sudden these binational laws become really flexible. And so we were interested in understanding how can we disrupt this moment as a way to instigate a discussion. So we have this enormous parking lot where we teach, which is right at the border. It's a forgotten or it's an underused bus station, and we decided to occupy it for a 24-hour event. So we called the agency that rents these out to the Department of Transportation, and that the goal was to take as many of them out of commission for as many hours as possible. These things are, they're highly profitable. They're rented hourly, and they do the job of controlling traffic. So here we are with our students. We were able to rent 256 of them for 48 hours. And part of the exercise, always through our sort of digital kind of fabrication and calculation tools, is to work with unskilled labor as a way to empower that labor. And so to work with unskilled labor, which meant ourselves and our students, was to precisely predict and lay out what this installation would be and how the field of objects could become unified. And so all of the design was just in the length of the chains and how they were numbered and tagged for hanging these barrels up to create this kind of folded cloud above us. And what this gave us is really interesting moments of light and shadow occupying the ground, but also as the sun was setting, we were able to kind of amplify the reach of the object or of the field beyond itself through the reflectivity that you find in these kinds of sort of parking structures. And of course, police is always sort of there wondering what it is that we're doing. But we ended up having really a big event and a Beaux-Arts ball party with our students. And the idea, this was the very first semester we arrived there, 6 weeks after we had arrived, and this was one way for us to kind of to have a handshake discussion with our students and with our context, bringing in our own kind of thinking, but also asking them to dress up as the human or the character that they imagine this landscape controls. And so it turned into this amazing Halloween kind of thing where, someone dressed like Pablo Escobar, who had somehow sort of evaded the border control. And so it became a really interesting moment. And then things like this happened where some of our students really took it seriously, and here she's wearing a piece of infrastructure. So throughout the evening, we were talking about sort of infrastructural vestiges or devices that control our spaces, and we absolutely loved seeing her with a sort of a piece of pipe on her head.
So for the next project, we'll talk a bit about data insecurities and how that sort of changes this boundary between a kind of a public and the forces which might monitor that public. And this is our selfie wall project. So it starts with an understanding of how this somewhat seemingly innocuous act of just kind of self-promotion or sort of social networking might actually have kind of spatial implications and might be tied to a kind of geography of surveillance in public space. And so it's common now for those photos that we upload all the time to be to have all this metadata associated with those, and the metadata includes geolocation and other features that are sort of have a quite obvious relationship to the ways in which different people behave in space. But they're also able to be scraped for other types of information, and that information gets assigned to the space in which it was scraped. So things like facial recognition software can determine the mood of somebody as they upload a photo, and if that photo is tagged to a particular space, then researchers and actually security forces can start to identify the kind of mood of a space. Which has implications for different sort of breaking points in crowd dynamics during protests and things like this. It also has implications for sort of tourism and navigation software and things like that that are a little bit more on the private side of things. But the project was really an attempt to foreground the relationships, the kind of spatial implications of this overabundance of geotagged data and facial recognition data by sort of trying to coerce this behavior in public. And so as a kind of formal analysis, trying to understand the ways in which photographs are kind of enhanced or perhaps photography is induced through things like umbrellas that bounce light and kind of barn doors that scatter light from studio lights and things like that. So we designed a kind of custom and customizable aperture. You can see our dog is actually really important to our process. He's not wearing one of the apertures. He actually just had surgery in this photo, but we thought it was a nice touch. So we designed this kind of customizable aperture, which is able to bounce and scatter light, direct light, both during the daytime and at night, in order to produce a kind of apparatus, a kind of public apparatus that induces self-photography. And as Ursula mentioned, the kind of tactic or the technique that we employ often in these projects, often of necessity, is to make the biggest impact with the kind of lowest set of skills and the least amount of material and the least amount of time possible. And so we develop a technique that we kind of lovingly call our paper architecture, which is kind of a folding technique that really helps to enact a kind of a large-scale, kind of rapidly deployable public space quite quickly. So here we're using flip-milled composite aluminum panels that are scored in much the same way that you would score a kind of paper model in studio into these two components, the kind of what we call the loop and the cross. And so the loop, which is sort of the outer band, has the ability to direct and scatter light, and the cross kind of lends structural rigidity to the overall assembly, making this a kind of matrix. And so from over 150 pieces, we have something like 16 discrete units that are kind of infinitely varying in the field in order to achieve different kinds of lighting effects. And through this field, we generate not only the kind of lighting conditions, but also optical conditions of kind of exposure and enclosure, so that we can create a kind of outdoor room within the public space. So here you're seeing a kind of deployment of augmented lighting and these tunable LED arrays, which you'll see soon. the arrangement of the structural crosses, which are pretty straightforward, and the play of light and shadow as it sort of wraps around this kind of remnant of an exterior wall. And working through the project, kind of negotiating these multiple threads of ways in which we are viewed and viewing, ways in which we are both private and public in the act of taking a quite individualized picture, but doing it in a public space. We designed this form. So here you can see people using it during its deployment, but here you're on the inside of the installation where we have a tunable LED array that goes from kind of white to warm white color tones in order to be sort of the most flattering to skin tones. We kind of call this like an Instagram filter in real life, where you can sort of navigate the wall in order to find kind of your best self. Often we found this behavior. We had a great question from students earlier about, what do you learn from the deployment of some of your projects. We learn a lot. We were actually here watching most of this happen and unfold, but we found that many people actually just wanted to take a photo of the wall, which isn't really the design of the wall. You're supposed to face the wall and take a photo, but they wanted to be backlit. Here you see on the outside of the wall we have a kind of the opposite array in the color spectrum from white to cool white, which provides sort of more accurate color rendition and perhaps less flattering. So you have to feel really, really good about yourself if you're taking photos on this side of the wall. And here you can see the arrangement in daylight with a little detail. These are kind of pillows or baffles that we designed to insert within the shell, which during the day has this effect of kind of a dappled light, but at night helps to diffuse the light into a kind of soft and even glow, like a vanity fixture would in a custom bathroom. And here you can see more details. And the types of behaviors that this kind of provoked played themselves out in kind of the real space of the installation, but also the kind of accompanying digital space nearby, which I'll talk about in a second. But here you can see some of the intentions here were to create this kind of game of activity happening within the wall and sort of being viewed as accessible to the public outside. Here you see kids really enjoying a game with their mother. And here you can see the kind of intention versus the reality with the same couple taking a photo at the wall. So on the left you can see sort of how we intended the wall to be used, which was to provide this kind of soft glow and flattering light. And on the right you can see the kind of abuse of the project just for the for the kind of Instagram reality of things, to say, these are the photos that say I was there at this project in this space and at this time. And so both behaviors, I guess, are sort of documented here. And what we paired this with, because as we build objects, we also build arguments and we build sort of campaigns in order to understand the relationship of objects to these shifts in contemporary culture and security. We paired this with a kind of online presence, which was in real time, sort of aggregating all the photos that were taken on the site, along with all the tags, and sort of exposing some of the easily identifiable metadata that could be gleaned from those photos, and displaying this in a kind of peripheral environment. So most people happened upon the kind of media wall, sort of didactic space, after they had already sort of uploaded their data willingly, and we were able to sort of collect comments from people both digitally and sort of as we were there about this kind of experience of disjuncture between an act that they thought was rather private within their social network, but that actually exposes a great deal of private information. Here you can see some of the amazing photos that were aggregated to that website, and some of the great people of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez that came to this event.
And we'll leave you with this last project, which is very fresh and it's still under development. And we're moving here at the scale of the atmosphere. We live where we live. It's the absolute high desert. It's about 4,000 feet above sea level, and we feel and we have the sense that we ingest the continent and the sky in terms of dust. The Chihuahuan Desert spans both the U.S. and Mexico borders across, and it is kind of one of the producers of global dust. And we have a dusty season in the spring where events like these happen, where within matters of minutes, all visibility is gone, and it's not only a health hazard, but it's really truly a hazard in terms of traffic, accidents, and things like that. And so this is a phenomenon we've had to learn how to live with, but also to operate within. And so, digging a bit deeper, this kind of event enacts a complete infrastructure of surveillance at the regional scale. So, in the U.S.-Mexico border, there is this kind of the securocratic regime that we've been mentioning in terms of controlling bodies, but there's also another layer of these monitors that monitor air quality, generally at the regional scale, understanding trends, but also kind of anticipating the fears of airborne terrorism. And historically, the U.S. military is aware and has been kind of testing these ideas of kind of agricultural terrorism and things like that, where dust can actually become weaponized. We can, as we all know, we can change the weather, but we can also change the quality of air within minutes. And so dust devils and haboobs, these kinds of events that happen, they are classified in terms of their scale, but also the time at which they happen. And you can imagine in this kind of geology, which is really sort of at the surface and apparent, paired with informal settlement in Juarez that you see there, it creates a sort of an incredibly thick kind of air. And for us, that's an opportunity to kind of to imagine what our role would be in this kind of atmospheric insecurity. We get these things that are called inversions, where because the temperature differential between night and day, especially in the summer, can be about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, where the surface of the ground can be 140 degrees, but then at night it's 70 degrees. It's a lot cooler, and so cold air gets trapped low to the surface by a layer of hot air, and it creates this. You see this kind of dust cloud that just hovers above the cities, and that traps all of the dust that's been produced that day. And so these inversions are really detrimental to health and for respiratory disease. And here it is, and then in the mornings it starts to dissipate and it kind of swirls around the valley. El Paso and Juarez are both trapped in the valley between their mountains, two sort of mountain ranges, as you see. And so the project site is an underserved community in Juarez, and then it's scattered throughout El Paso on the U.S. side. So this is Anapra, where there is absolutely no infrastructure. This is the free economic zone that boomed in the 90s with the sort of the advent of maquiladoras, which are very, very low-wage factories. So people migrated north into Juarez, and now it's become a 2 million person metroplex. But people live like this. They built their own homes, and there's absolutely no help for infrastructure either by the corporations or the local government. A third of our students live in Juarez, and they say that they just have to like sweep the sand out of their homes every day because it just builds up like this. So it's a real issue. And at the larger regional scale, we are mapping what we are looking at as erosive landscapes, or the origin sites of where the dust is coming from and where it's settling, as a way to start thinking about infrastructural and economic neglect of how these public spaces and these urban environments are completely sort of left behind without any investment, and looking at pressure, cross-border pressure pockets, and how they might sort of enable the movement of dust, and also the infrastructure that's always there, but it's not really helping. And so at the three scales of infrastructure, we're looking at the tumbleweed, which is really present where we are, and it's apparently an invasive species from Russia, which is funny at this moment in our political history. But the tumbleweed is pervasive. The surveillance camera is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And in Juarez, these are electrical junction boxes that people have outside their homes when they hack the larger electrical infrastructure for power. And so we're imagining that maybe we can have dust sensors housed in these kinds of objects as a kind of a distributed network of nodes that are sensing and measuring dust in order to empower the local population with information. So the first iteration was looking at 3D printed tumbleweeds that can potentially sort of hide in the desert, to hacking and emptying out camera housings, and went through this exercise of designing these flexible inserts that could create sort of aerodynamic pockets, and then within them we can actually hide dust sensors and sort of distribute them in public. So there it is, this thing with this cautionary orange as a design exercise, but also these will be distributed after you see them here in a gallery exhibition. And the sensors that we've already distributed and installed are living within the electrical junction boxes, and the bundle is the sensor bundle itself. We've designed and worked with a makerspace in China, where it has capability to ping up through cell phone and Wi-Fi information, but also it's self-powered through this solar panel. And our favorite part is designing the inside that no one will ever see, but it's an exercise in sort of figuring out this packaging and what does it mean for this kind of infrastructure to be inhabited and hacked. And the sensors were out for about a week while we were kind of working through the data. It takes a lot of robust data, but the nodes of the sensors, you see them here labeled. And we've paired this information with wind patterns and from the wind towers, especially at the airport, to understand not only the origin of the dust, but also where it's moving around and what its intensities are. And you can see here the El Paso Mountains and the Juarez Mountains on the south, divided by the Rio Grande, which is the political boundary. And what we're realizing is that the wind patterns, as they shift from morning to afternoon, that they move and they swirl this mass of shared dust between the two nations, clearly obliterating this idea of a line. So part of this project is to redraw the political border as this kind of thickened sort of atmosphere that exists in the air that is enabled by the air movement. And so the side note is that the political border is a futile exercise, but also to talk about maybe not only shared responsibility, but also shared kind of information about what is happening to the air and what this kind of infrastructural neglect enacts. And so this is the last slide. We're developing these kinds of weather maps that really try to depict the issues of the dust and the amount of dust in a visual kind of understandable database. And then the next phase of the project, we just kicked this off last week, is to have community events and to start to talk to the communities and turn this data into information that can be taken to local governance for change. And we'll, if it plays. So we're visualizing it with our amazing teammate, Mary O'Malley, who actually lives here in Toronto. We're both visualizing the dust measured from the sensors as vectors, but also as particulate matter, and kind of working that out through the geological or topographic, I guess, maps of the region. This is really sped up. It doesn't move this fast. We just sped it up for this lecture, but what we were excited about is to start to see accumulation patterns and where the dust ends up resting. So not only to talk about who's causing it, but where it might be going. And so we'll leave you with these few words as thoughts about our practice. We at Agency like to aggregate what we call a weak power, and we take things into our own hands. We operate in the margins and like to occupy liminal zones. We're always interested in constraint with every project. And we like to say that we're sort of the generic cloaked in the particular, and we operate through tactics at all scales. Thank you.
I guess this pertains more to what you presented at the beginning of the lecture, but I was just wondering if you've received any kind of resistance or pushback from either like the government, military, or even the general public for drawing attention to these kind of charged or even secret practices?
Well, so the book comes out in the fall, so we don't know yet what will happen. But when we visit the sites, we're generally very honest. You know, we present our case that we're interested in kind of the urban typologies that the military is simulating. And because most of the U.S. military is privatized through contracts, through private companies, they have such incredible power in our governance that it's not an issue. And so they very willingly share information with us. We have recordings of incredible things that they say about their learnings, about certain cultures. And so it doesn't, I don't know, this is the first time we talk about this outside of our country, so I don't know how this plays out in Canada, but because, the private security industry has taken over our military, there doesn't seem to be any concern about us writing a book about these issues, which is really depressing, but yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was really interesting. I have two questions. The first one's just a follow-up. What happened in the installation with the traffic cones? Was there any perceptible effect in those 250 cones being taken out of commission?
No, I don't think so. No, yeah, but it was more. Something's echoing. It was. For us, it became, that was the way to trigger our kind of understanding of the context, because as soon as we arrived, they were there, so ubiquitous. But it became a larger conversation with our students who are directly affected by them, especially the ones who cross the border every day to study with us. And so while the project started as this kind of idea about co-opting these objects, more pleasantly, it turned into us getting to know the students, but also the students sort of re-looking at their environment and the infrastructures that control their movement daily in a different way. A lot of times through our teaching, we kind of have to sort of reintroduce them to their context because it's there from the day they're born, and so it's not something that as all of us do, right, that is seen. And so while I don't think the impact on the city's traffic patterns was felt, it became some other kind of conversation.
I will say they picked them up really quickly the next morning. They were very slow to drop them off.
And they gave us their newest ones. They were beautiful. They're just brand new. I don't know where they got them from, but they thought it was an exhibit, so yeah.
And then the second, which you kind of already touched on, is more about how does that studio work out? Like, because you have people from both countries, and your practice is sort of like about undermining the line and how other flows sort of like don't obey the line. And so, how does an architecture studio, how does that dynamic work when you have students from both sides of the border with different frames of reference, and you integrate them into sort of like all these design projects? Like, how do you notice a difference in approach to design? Do you notice a difference in how they sort of like perceive power coming from maybe in Mexico, where there's like the state is not as, I mean, maybe it is more, but I know you mentioned the securocratic regime in the border from ICE, but in Mexico you kind of have the narcos and the government. So like, how does those two frames of reference collide into an architecture firm?
Yeah, so I'll try to wade into that question. So I think actually our students, in the academic context, our students are some of our biggest inspirations for the conception of the territory as sort of radically shared. That, you know, these students that we engage with almost every day are just totally binational entities, and the exchange between, I don't even want to say between, but the kind of culture in our region is a culture that exists equally to a large extent on both sides of the border, and there's kind of a fluid movement, families are on both sides, and obviously, you know, different individuals have different abilities to sort of physically be on either side of the border, but the kind of imaginary and the kind of conception of the region is as, for those who grew up and live in the region, it is as a region. And so we were actually blown away when we were sort of early in our kind of tenure at Texas Tech, talking to students who we would approach the kind of binational problem with these kind of preconceptions of the line being a kind of something to overcome or something to sort of surmount, and the students would be the first to tell you that it's just they're almost blind to it. It's just kind of a daily fact of life that they cross or that they need to cross. But you're right that in the kind of nuanced understandings of the kind of like within the shared context, you can sort of privilege different perspectives, right? You can try to understand the kind of actor network that exists within the region and the kind of power dynamics that are incredibly asymmetric depending on your vantage point, depending on your kind of resources. And so I guess I also just want to, maybe you have some other thoughts, I just also want to make a distinction between the kind of the work of the studio, of agency, and the work of the students. There's kind of a distinction, maybe without so big of a difference, but there are kind of academic pursuits within the college that address perhaps more, I would say less targeted goals, right? In terms of like our targets as a practice, like our students' targets aren't necessarily our targets. We let their targets or their perspectives sort of evolve through the work and through their own unique experiences. And of course, we're in conversation with them and we're in dialogue with them, but we actually enjoy the kind of robust variety of perspectives that the same region can kind of promote.
I mean, I think, well, maybe I have one question for you, actually. I was curious, how do you decide, given the kind of plethora of issues that are only accelerating in the current political climate, how do you decide, how do you decide on some of these things to pursue, like the question of the dust, or that one as an example? Like, I'm curious, because they're sort of very pointed and they resonate across larger issues, but I was curious how you decided how to zoom in and narrow down.
Right. I think the overall umbrella is to look at sort of the regimes of security and of control and of measuring and monitoring, and when we moved to the context, is also when the work really just grew so fast and became focused in this way. And what I guess right now our filter of targeting work or research is looking at the different kind of extremities of the security apparatus. And so the book looks at the military view, the dust looks at surveillance and cameras and monitoring, I think, and then the infrastructure looks at that, and so it's all really the same work that fits within this kind of section of moving through scales, through the idea of who is behind the camera, what direction is information moving towards, and who is controlling that information. Also, dust was one of those materials that when we moved there, people said, "Yeah, this is a dusty season," and we were just so amazed that this is so much part of the life, and then started to ask the questions and finding out that there are factories on either side of the border that will increase production when the wind can push the pollution into the other country, and therefore evade, sort of air quality monitoring or regulations. And so again, the surveillance is always our interest, but then because where we live, it's so multifaceted that I feel like we will have work for hundreds of years. It's just a matter of sort of focusing through the material kind of manifestation of that kind of control. So it's not a direct answer, but it's all there when we're there.
And do you see any potential to subvert at larger scales these apparatuses or apparati of control? I mean, you're obviously doing it in a way within the installations. Do you think, not so much whether the installations can scale up, but whether whether by you or larger organizations, maybe it's a kind of question of optimism or pessimism about.
Well, we have to be optimistic. I think we've been thinking about this a lot, right? The so what question, what happens after we work on these projects. And the dust project we're really excited about because we have forged a constellation of collaborators. So anywhere from geologists and sort of dust scientists to organizations that are interested in binational ecology and the future of the region. We have a 50-year water exploration date. And so there's incredible work that's already being done to kind of think about how do we live in this context. And so the next phase is sort of setting up something that we can't yet talk about, but a much larger kind of robust network within which we are the architects, but then everyone else is part of community organizations that have the power to enact change at policy level. So the hope is that something trickles up and we start to talk about paved roads and we start to talk about moving schools away from border crossings and things like that. So we're optimistic about that. So the projects physically themselves are really an exercise in sort of material assemblages and forging a public space for discussion, and then just like you saw with the Feral Federation, then the larger projects are sort of longer term, more robust, kind of building up enough facts or data so that we can then move it up to policy. So.
Well, listen, I think particularly for students sort of in thesis or approaching thesis, I think to see a firm that, is so clear in a kind of agenda and in a method and kind of questioning also, I think, the limits of what one does as architects is really inspiring. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.